Shadows in the playground. Maya sat on the cracked, graffiti-stained bench near the swings, her small frame hunched against the biting cold. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and rusted metal, a smell she had grown accustomed to over the weeks she'd spent calling this playground her home. The once cheerful play structures now loomed like quiet sentinels in the dark, their chipped paint and sagging frames a reflection of her life, worn and forgotten. The girl pulled her knees closer to her chest, wrapping her thin coat around her like armor against the chill. The coat wasn't much, a faded olive green with missing buttons, but it was all she had. Underneath, her school uniform clung to her, wrinkled and too tight, evidence of a life outgrown without resources to keep up. Maya tried not to think about how hungry she was, the gnawing ache in her stomach, a constant companion she had learned to ignore. Instead, she focused on the rhythmic squeak of the swings as the wind gently pushed them back and forth, a ghostly reminder of children who once played here. Her heart ached, not just from the hunger or the cold, but from the weight of loneliness that pressed down on her. She didn't belong anywhere, not in the bright, bustling halls of her middle school, where the laughter of her classmates only highlighted her isolation, and certainly not here in this abandoned playground where her only company was the distant hum of passing cars. Maya reached into her backpack, her fingers brushing against the familiar, frayed edges of a photograph tucked inside. Pulling it out, she stared at the image. Her grandmother, smiling warmly, her arm draped protectively around Maya's younger self. The photo was faded, the colors muted, but the memory it captured was vibrant in Maya's mind. Her grandmother had been everything, her guardian, her comfort, her home. But that life was gone now, stolen by a cruel twist of fate that left Maya with no one. A sharp gust of wind made her shiver, and she quickly tucked the photo back into her bag. She couldn't let herself cry. Not here, not now. Crying wouldn't bring her grandmother back, wouldn't erase the nights she spent curled up on the cold, hard ground, hiding from the world. It wouldn't make the whispers at school go away, the ones that stabbed at her like needles. She's always wearing the same thing. A girl had sneered in the hallway just yesterday, her words dripping with disdain. Probably doesn't even have a washing machine. Another had laughed, their voices fading as Maya pretended not to hear. She hated how much their words hurt, how much she wished she could disappear. But she couldn't disappear. She had to keep going. For her grandmother, for herself, she couldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they got to her. As the night deepened, Maya unzipped her backpack again and pulled out her grandmother's old scarf. The fabric was soft and familiar, a small comfort against the biting cold. She wrapped it around her neck, burying her nose in the faint, lingering scent of lavender and soap. Closing her eyes, she allowed herself a fleeting moment of solace, pretending she was back in her grandmother's tiny apartment, where the warmth of love and the aroma of freshly baked biscuits made the world outside seem less cruel. Across the city, in a sprawling penthouse high above the chaos of the streets, Marcus Bennett stood by his floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the glittering skyline. To anyone else, his life looked perfect. Tailored suits, fast cars, a thriving tech empire. But tonight, the shimmering lights below did little to lift the heaviness in his chest. Marcus wasn't sure when the emptiness began. Maybe it was the day his father died, leaving him with a company he hadn't yet wanted to inherit. Or perhaps it was all those years spent chasing wealth, each success a fleeting high that left him feeling more hollow than the last. He had everything, and yet he felt as if he had nothing. He turned away from the window, loosening his tie as he walked to his home office. On his desk, a picture frame caught his eye, a photo of him as a young boy, standing proudly beside his mother outside their modest home. Her smile was radiant, her eyes full of warmth and pride, despite their humble circumstances. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. His mother had worked tirelessly to provide for him after his father abandoned them. She had sacrificed so much to give him a chance at a better life. And now, standing in the empire he had built, he wondered what she would think of the man he had become. Was she proud of him? Or would she see through the polished exterior to the man who had lost his way? He glanced at his running shoes by the door, a sudden urge to escape the confines of his sterile luxury apartment overtaking him. Maybe a run would clear his head, help him find something. Maya stirred awake as the faint glow of dawn began to creep over the horizon. Her body ached from another restless night on the hard, cold ground. Stretching, she winced as the stiffness in her muscles reminded her of the toll this life was taking. She needed to move quickly. The early morning joggers would soon be out, and she couldn't risk being seen. She gathered her belongings, her backpack, and her grandmother's scarf, and slipped through the gap in the playground's fence. Her steps were quiet and purposeful, her movements rehearsed from weeks of practice. Maya knew every hidden path, every blind spot in this part of the city. It was a skill born of necessity, one that kept her safe. Reaching the public restroom a few blocks away, she splashed cold water on her face, scrubbing away the dirt that clung to her skin. She avoided her reflection in the mirror, unable to face the gaunt, hollow-eyed girl staring back. Pulling on her school uniform, she tried to smooth out the wrinkles as best she could. She looked presentable. Not great, but enough to avoid drawing attention. That was all that mattered. The walk to school was quiet, the city just beginning to wake up. Maya kept her head down, blending into the crowd of students pouring into the building. At her locker, she carefully placed her backpack inside, as if it were a sacred artifact. It held everything she owned, everything that mattered. Losing it wasn't an option. The day dragged on, each class a blur as Maya fought to stay awake. By lunch, she retreated to her sanctuary, the library. It was the only place where she felt invisible, where the whispers and stares of her classmates couldn't reach her. She found her usual corner and sat down, pulling a random book from the shelf to give herself the illusion of purpose. But her mind wandered, her thoughts heavy with questions she couldn't answer. How long could she keep this up? How long before someone noticed, before someone realized the truth? Maya didn't know. All she knew was that she couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. As she sat there, the faint hum of activity around her faded into the background, and for a brief, fragile moment, the weight of her world seemed a little lighter. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't last. A chance encounter. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as Maya trudged out of school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The sharp November wind cut through her thin coat, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were a tangled mess. Fragments of whispers in the hallway, half-heard taunts, and the gnawing ache of hunger that wouldn't leave her alone. Maya pulled her grandmother's scarf tighter around her neck as she walked. She always took the long way back to the playground, avoiding streets where she might run into anyone who recognized her. The last thing she needed was for someone to see her and ask questions she couldn't answer. The playground was quiet, just the way she liked it. She slipped through the gap in the fence and made her way to her usual spot, a rusted slide tucked in the corner, half hidden by overgrown bushes. Maya climbed onto the platform at the top, curling into a ball with her backpack as a makeshift pillow. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes scanning the desolate park. This place, broken and forgotten, felt like her mirror. It was easier here, away from the noise of the world. Easier to pretend she was invisible. But tonight, she wasn't alone. Marcus Bennett adjusted his pace as he jogged through the neighborhood. His usual route had become too predictable, too comfortable, and he'd decided to explore a different part of the city. The neighborhood was quieter here, the streets narrower and lined with old, crumbling buildings. It wasn't the picturesque part of town he was used to, but it felt real. He rounded a corner and spotted a small park up ahead. It looked abandoned, the kind of place that hadn't seen children in years. Marcus slowed to a walk, drawn to the eerie stillness of the playground. The swings creaked softly in the wind, and the slide stood crooked, its paint peeling in long strips. As he stepped onto the gravel path, his eyes caught movement near the slide. There, perched at the top, was a small figure wrapped in a coat too big for her. She sat huddled, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the horizon as if searching for something far beyond her reach. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. The girl couldn't have been more than 12 or 13. What was she doing here alone at this hour? He hesitated, unsure if he should approach. She hadn't noticed him yet, and he didn't want to startle her. But something about the way she sat, her shoulders hunched, her frame so small against the backdrop of the fading light, pulled at him. "Hey," Marcus called out gently, his voice carrying across the playground. The girl's head snapped around, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, she froze, like a deer caught in headlights. Then, just as quickly, she grabbed a backpack that had been lying next to her and bolted down the slide. "Wait," Marcus shouted, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you." But she was already running, her footsteps echoing on the gravel as she disappeared through the fence. Marcus stood there, stunned. He'd only wanted to make sure she was okay, but now she was gone, and all that remained was the faint rustle of leaves in her wake. As he turned to leave, something on the slide caught his eye. A small, tattered notebook. He picked it up, flipping it open to find pages filled with neatly written notes and sketches. One page in particular made him pause, a pencil drawing of an older woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Below the sketch, in small, careful letters, was a single word: Grandma. Marcus felt a pang in his chest. This wasn't just a random girl skipping curfew. There was a story here, one he couldn't ignore. Maya's lungs burned as she ran, her legs carrying her far from the playground. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. Her heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing with fear and regret. Why had she stayed at the playground so late? She knew better. She'd been so careful about staying out of sight, about keeping her life a secret. And now someone had seen her, a stranger, a man. What if he called the police? What if they took her away? When she finally stopped, she was in an alley behind a row of closed shops. Leaning against a brick wall, Maya tried to catch her breath, her body trembling. She clutched her backpack tightly, her fingers digging into the worn fabric. It wasn't until the adrenaline began to fade that she realized something was missing. Her notebook. Maya's stomach dropped as she remembered where she'd left it, on the slide. She felt a wave of panic wash over her. That notebook was everything to her. It held her schoolwork, her drawings, and the one thing she couldn't bear to lose: the sketch of her grandmother. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry. Not now. She needed to think. Maybe the man hadn't seen it. Maybe it was still there. But the thought of going back terrified her. What if he was still there, waiting for her? Maya sank to the ground, burying her face in her hands. She felt so small, so helpless. For the first time in weeks, the weight of her situation threatened to crush her. She missed her grandmother more than ever, missed the safety and warmth of her old life. But that life was gone, and all she had left was a tattered backpack and a broken playground. And now, even that wasn't safe. Marcus sat in his car, the notebook resting on the passenger seat. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl, about the fear in her eyes, and the way she had clutched her backpack like it was her lifeline. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he felt an unshakable pull to help her. He glanced at the notebook again, flipping through the pages. Most of it was schoolwork, math problems, essays, notes about biology. But in between, there were sketches, beautiful, detailed drawings of flowers, animals, and people. One page had a series of doodles of a cat playing with a ball of yarn, while another showed a tree with sprawling roots and leaves that seemed to dance off the page. It was clear the girl was talented, but it was the drawing of her grandmother that struck Marcus the most. The love and care in every pencil stroke were palpable, and it made him wonder what had happened to the woman in the picture. He knew he couldn't just leave this alone. The girl was out there somewhere, scared and alone. And he couldn't ignore that. But what could he do? He wasn't a social worker or a counselor. He was just a man who had stumbled upon a situation he didn't understand. Still, He couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. With a deep breath, Marcus picked up the notebook and started the car. If he couldn't find the girl tonight, he would go back to the playground tomorrow. She might return, and when she did, he wanted to be there. Not to scare her, not to pry, but to help. Because something in his heart told him that if he didn't, no one else would. Trust and tremors. The next morning, Marcus woke up restless. The girl had lingered in his thoughts all night, her wide, frightened eyes haunting his sleep. He couldn't shake the memory of her small figure curled up on that slide, clutching her backpack like it held her entire world. The city outside his penthouse window was bathed in soft morning light, but Marcus felt a heaviness that the golden rays couldn't pierce. On his kitchen counter lay the tattered notebook he'd found. He picked it up again, flipping through its pages with growing unease. It was more than a collection of schoolwork and sketches. It was a glimpse into the life of a girl who had fallen through the cracks. He had to do something. Returning to the playground seemed like the best option. So he pulled on a hoodie and sneakers, grabbed the notebook, and headed out. Maya woke with a start, her body stiff from another night spent on the cold ground. She had found refuge in an alley behind a closed laundromat, too afraid to return to the playground. Her heart sank as she remembered the previous night. She had left her notebook behind. It was gone, and with it, a part of her that felt too raw to lose. What if the man from the park had found it? Worse, what if he had opened it? The thought made her stomach churn. Her drawings, her thoughts, her connection to her grandmother, all of it was laid bare in those pages. She hugged her knees to her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You can't fix it," she whispered to herself, trying to stem the tide of panic. "You just have to move on." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. That notebook was more than paper and ink. It was her anchor, the one thing that grounded her in a world that often felt too vast and uncaring. She couldn't just let it go. With a deep breath, Maya made a decision. She would go back to the playground. If the notebook was still there, she would grab it and run. If the man was there, she didn't know what she would do, but she couldn't let fear stop her. Not this time. Marcus parked his car near the playground, his heart pounding as he stepped onto the gravel path. The swings moved gently in the breeze, their rhythmic creak the only sound in the otherwise silent park. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of the girl. Nothing. He sighed, sitting down on a bench near the slide. He felt foolish, like he was chasing shadows. What were the odds that she'd come back? Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she would. Something about the way she had looked at him, equal parts fear and desperation, told him this playground was more than just a hiding place. It was her refuge, her last sanctuary. He pulled the notebook from his bag, turning it over in his hands. He wasn't sure what he would say if she showed up, but he knew he had to try. For now, all he could do was wait. Maya approached the playground with cautious steps, her heart hammering in her chest. From the safety of the bushes, she scanned the area, her eyes darting from the swings to the slide. When she saw him, sitting on the bench with her notebook in his hands, her stomach twisted. He was back. Her first instinct was to run, but she forced herself to stay put. The man didn't look dangerous. He hadn't chased her the night before, hadn't shouted or threatened her. And now he was just sitting there, staring at the notebook like it held some great mystery. Maya bit her lip, weighing her options. She could leave and never come back, find another hiding place and start over. But the thought of losing her notebook forever was unbearable. It wasn't just hers. It was her grandmother's, too, a piece of their shared history. She couldn't abandon it. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Maya stepped out from the bushes. Her hands trembled as she walked toward him, her body tense and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. "Hey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked up, startled. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, slowly, he stood, holding the notebook out in front of him like an offering. "I think this belongs to you," he said gently. Maya hesitated, her eyes darting between his face and the notebook. He didn't seem threatening, but she couldn't let her guard down. She took a tentative step closer, her fingers itching to snatch the notebook and run. "It's okay," he said, sensing her hesitation. "I'm not here to hurt you. I found this last night, and I thought you might want it back." Maya took another step, then another, until she was close enough to grab the notebook. Her hands trembled as she clutched it to her chest, relief washing over her like a wave. She started to back away, but his voice stopped her. "Wait," he said. "I'm Marcus. What's your name?" She froze, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but something in his tone, a mixture of kindness and concern, made her pause. "Maya," she said finally, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the wind. Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "Maya. That's a beautiful name." She didn't respond, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. Marcus took a step back, giving her space. "I don't want to scare you," he said. I couldn't stop thinking about you. Seeing you out here last night, it didn't feel right. You shouldn't have to be here." Maya's chest tightened. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I don't need your help." Marcus frowned but didn't press. "Maybe not," he said. "But if you ever do, I want you to know you're not alone." Maya blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice. She had spent so long feeling invisible, like the world had turned its back on her. Hearing those words, even from a stranger, was like a spark in the darkness. "I should go," she said, taking a step back. Marcus nodded. "Okay, but if you ever need anything at all, you can find me here. I'll come back tomorrow, just in case." Maya hesitated, then turned and walked away, clutching the notebook tightly. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, relief, and something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Marcus watched her go, his heart heavy with unanswered questions. He didn't know what her story was, but he could see the pain etched into her every movement. He couldn't force her to accept help, but he wasn't ready to give up either. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with profit margins or board meetings. He didn't know how or why, but he knew he had to help Maya. Somehow, he had to find a way to reach her. Fragile connections. Maya sat on the edge of the cracked fountain in the center of a park, a few blocks from the playground, the notebook clutched tightly in her hands. She traced her fingers along its frayed edges, her mind replaying the encounter with Marcus. Why had he waited for her? Why had he cared enough to keep her notebook safe? People didn't just do things like that, not for someone like her. Her experience with the world had taught her that kindness often came with strings, and trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet there had been something different about him. Something that tugged at the part of her that still longed to believe in good. Maya shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She had survived this long by staying invisible, by keeping people at arm's length. Letting anyone in, even someone like Marcus, was a risk she couldn't take. That evening, Marcus found himself back at the playground, sitting on the same bench where he'd waited the night before. He had no idea if Maya would come back, or if he had scared her off completely. But something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. The memory of her small, fragile figure haunted him. He had spent the day researching resources for at-risk youth, combing through lists of shelters, outreach programs, and social services. He'd even called a few organizations to ask for advice, careful not to reveal too much about Maya. The responses had been polite but frustratingly generic. Encourage her to reach out, report the situation to the authorities, or worse, there's only so much we can do. It wasn't enough. None of it was enough. Marcus leaned back on the bench, staring at the darkening sky. He didn't know why he felt so connected to this girl he had just met, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting wasn't a coincidence. He thought about his own childhood, about the times when he and his mother had struggled to make ends meet. He remembered the sting of hunger, the shame of wearing clothes that didn't fit, and the way people's pity felt like a weight he couldn't carry. Maybe that was why he couldn't walk away now, because he saw something of himself in her. Maya hadn't planned to go back to the playground, but as the sun began to set, her feet carried her there almost instinctively. The notebook was tucked safely in her backpack, and her grandmother's scarf was wrapped around her neck, its warmth a small comfort against the evening chill. She stopped at the edge of the park, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. Marcus was there, sitting on the same bench as before, his posture relaxed, but his gaze watchful. He hadn't seen her yet, and for a moment, Maya considered turning around and leaving. But something held her there. She didn't know what she expected to find. Answers, safety, a connection she didn't dare to hope for. But her feet moved before her mind could catch up. Slowly, she stepped out of the shadows and into the playground. Marcus noticed her immediately. He stood up, his movements careful, as if he didn't want to spook her. "Maya," he said, his voice warm but not overbearing. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." Maya stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone guarded. Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because I want to help you," he said finally. "You shouldn't have to go through this alone." Maya's jaw tightened. "I'm fine," she said, the same automatic response she gave everyone who asked. "I don't need your help." Marcus nodded slowly, as if he expected the answer but wasn't deterred by it. "Okay," he said, "but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying." Maya frowned, confused. "Why? You don't even know me." "No," Marcus admitted. "I don't. But I see you, Maya, and I know what it's like to feel invisible, like no one cares. I've been there." She studied him, her eyes narrowing. "You? Someone like you doesn't know what that's like." Marcus gave her a small, sad smile. "Maybe not now," he said, "but I wasn't always this guy with a nice car and a fancy apartment. I grew up with a single mom who worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed. There were times we didn't know if we'd make rent, times when I felt like the world had forgotten about us. So yeah, I do know." Maya looked away, her fingers gripping the straps of her backpack. She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself feel seen for the first time in what felt like forever. But the walls she had built around herself were thick and unyielding, and she wasn't sure she knew how to let them down. "You don't have to believe me," Marcus said gently, sensing her hesitation. "But I'm not going anywhere. If you need someone to talk to, or even just someone to sit with, I'll be here." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, and the faint hum of distant traffic filled the silence. Finally, Maya nodded, a barely perceptible motion, before turning and walking toward the slide. She didn't run this time, didn't disappear into the shadows. Instead, she sat down at the base of the slide, pulling her coat tighter around her. Marcus stayed where he was, giving her space but not leaving. He sat back down on the bench, his presence steady and unobtrusive. They didn't exchange another word that night, but something unspoken passed between them, a fragile thread of trust beginning to form. Over the next few days, Maya and Marcus settled into an unspoken routine. Every evening, Marcus would return to the playground, sometimes with a book or a thermos of coffee, and wait. Maya didn't always show up, but when she did, she would sit at the slide while Marcus stayed on the bench. They rarely spoke, but the silence between them was no longer heavy with fear. One evening, Marcus brought 2 sandwiches and a bottle of water, leaving them on the bench as he walked a short distance away. Maya hesitated, eyeing the food warily. Her stomach growled, but she didn't want to owe him anything. After several long minutes, she finally gave in, grabbing the sandwich and water before retreating to her spot of the slide. "Thank you," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "You're welcome," Marcus replied, his tone neutral but kind. That small exchange felt like a breakthrough, and it gave Marcus hope. He didn't push her, didn't pry into her life, but he was always there, a steady presence in the background. And slowly, bit by bit, Maya began to let her guard down. She started talking, at first in short, clipped sentences, but gradually opening up more. She told him about her grandmother, about how they used to bake cookies together and watch old movies on weekends. She didn't talk about how she had ended up in the playground, and Marcus didn't ask. He knew she would share when she was ready. In return, Marcus shared stories from his own life, about his mother's fierce determination, about the struggles they had faced, and about how he had started his company with nothing but an old laptop and a dream. He didn't sugarcoat the hard parts, but he also made her laugh with stories of his early failures. For the first time in a long while, Maya began to feel something she thought she had lost forever: hope. But beneath the fragile connection they were building, a storm was brewing, one that threatened to shatter the fragile trust they had forged. The storm breaks. The next week passed in a fragile rhythm. Maya began to trust Marcus, though she never fully let her walls down. They continued to meet at the playground, sharing quiet conversations and moments of silence that felt more comfortable than awkward. But Maya was always watchful, her eyes darting to the edges of the park, as if expecting someone, or something, to burst in and destroy her fragile sanctuary. Marcus noticed her anxiety but didn't push her. He brought her food, sometimes books, and once a warm blanket he insisted she take. She resisted at first, but her shivering hands betrayed her need, and eventually she accepted it with a muttered thanks. One evening, Marcus brought a small notebook and a set of colored pencils. "I saw the drawings in your other notebook," he said, placing the items on the bench between them. "You're really talented. Thought you might like these." Maya hesitated, her gaze flicking between Marcus and the notebook. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the smooth cover of the new notebook. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Marcus said, "but I wanted to." For a moment, Maya's face softened, and Marcus thought he saw a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. But just as quickly, her expression hardened again. She picked up the notebook and pencils and walked back to her spot by the slide, her back to him as she sat down. Marcus sighed but didn't press further. He could sense her inner battle, the way she teetered between trust and fear. He could wait. The storm broke 2 nights later. Maya arrived at the playground late, her body tense and her face pale. She clutched her backpack tightly, her knuckles white against the worn fabric. Marcus, already sitting on the bench, immediately noticed something was wrong. "Maya," he said softly, "what happened?" She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Nothing," she muttered, but her trembling hands betrayed her words. Marcus stood and took a cautious step toward her. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," he said, his voice steady and calm. "But if something's wrong, I want to help." Maya looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. "Why do you care?" she snapped. "You don't even know me." Marcus held her gaze, his expression unflinching. "Maybe I don't," he said, "but I care anyway. And I think you know that." For a moment, Maya seemed on the verge of saying something, but then she shook her head and turned away. "You can't help me," she said, her voice cracking. "No one can." She started to walk toward the slide, but Marcus stepped in her path. "Maya," he said firmly, "you don't have to do this alone. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." That was when she snapped. "Why do you keep saying that?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty playground. "You don't know what it's like. You don't know what it's like to have nothing, to be no one." Her words hit Marcus like a punch to the chest, but he didn't flinch. He stood there, letting her anger wash over him, knowing it wasn't really directed at him. "I know more than you think," he said quietly when she finally stopped. "And I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one sees you." Maya shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. You can't." "Then help me understand," Marcus said, his voice soft but insistent. "I'm here, Maya. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, Marcus saw the full weight of her pain. Her face crumpled, and she sank to the ground, her backpack falling to her side. "I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I sleep here because I don't have a home. I don't have anyone." Marcus's heart broke. He crouched down in front of her, his voice steady and calm despite the ache in his chest. "You have someone now," he said. "You have me." The following morning, Marcus made a decision. Maya couldn't keep living like this, hiding in the shadows, carrying the weight of the world on her small shoulders. She deserved better, and he was determined to help her find it. But helping Maya wouldn't be simple. He knew he couldn't just swoop in and fix everything. Trust had to be built slowly, and any misstep could shatter the fragile bond they had forged. Marcus spent the day making calls, reaching out to organizations and individuals who might be able to provide the support Maya needed. He also began researching legal options, wondering if there was a way to ensure her safety without involving social services, which he suspected she feared. He didn't want her to feel like her life was being taken out of her hands. By the time evening rolled around, Marcus had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He returned to the playground, hoping Maya would show up. She did. Maya arrived just as the sun was setting, her steps hesitant but less guarded than before. She approached Marcus with a small nod, sitting on the slide as she always did. "I've been thinking," Marcus began, keeping his tone light but serious. "There are places that can help, Maya. Safe places. People who can give you a real home." Maya stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "No," she said sharply. "I don't want to go to a shelter. They'll ask questions, and then they'll take me away." Marcus frowned. "Take you where?" "To foster care," Maya said bitterly. "And I'm not going back there." Marcus's stomach tightened. This was the first time she had mentioned foster care, and it gave him a glimpse of the trauma she carried. "Maya," he said gently, "not all help is the same. There are people who care, people who want to help without taking away your choices." Maya shook her head, her voice trembling. "I can't trust them." "Then trust me," Marcus said, his voice firm but kind. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you, I promise." Maya looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then, finally, she nodded. It was a small gesture, but to Marcus, it felt like the beginning of something monumental. "Okay," she said quietly. "But just no foster care. Promise me." "I promise," Marcus said, his heart swelling with determination. "We'll figure this out together." For the first time, Maya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But as the storm of her past loomed in the distance, neither of them knew just how hard the road ahead would be. Breaking the cycle. The morning light filtered through the broken slats of the playground fence as Maya woke with a start. She hadn't intended to fall asleep here again, but the exhaustion had caught up with her. Wrapping the warm blanket Marcus had given her tightly around her shoulders, she sat up, her eyes scanning the empty park. Marcus had left hours ago after spending most of the evening convincing her to let him help. She had agreed, albeit reluctantly, but now the uncertainty crept back in. Could she really trust him? What if he was just like everyone else who had made promises they didn't keep? Pulling her notebook from her backpack, Maya flipped through the pages. Her grandmother's face stared back at her from one of her sketches, the lines of her smile drawn with so much care it almost felt alive. "What would you do, Grandma?" Maya whispered, her voice breaking. "Would you trust him?" Her grandmother's voice was a memory now, soft and comforting, but it echoed in her mind. "Always trust your heart, Maya. It knows the way, even when your head is full of doubt." Maya tucked the notebook away, stood, and began walking. The decision to trust Marcus still weighed on her, but she didn't have many options. If there was even a small chance he could help her escape this life, she had to take it. Marcus was pacing his apartment when Maya arrived at the address he had scribbled on a scrap of paper the night before. The penthouse building towered over the city, its glass facade shimmering in the sunlight. Maya stood outside for several minutes, staring at the entrance, before finally summoning the courage to go in. The doorman gave her a curious glance but didn't stop her when she handed him the note Marcus had given her. Moments later, she was in the elevator, her heart pounding as it climbed higher and higher. When the doors opened, Marcus was standing there, his face lighting up with relief. "Maya," he said, stepping forward but stopping just short of hugging her. "I'm glad you came." She nodded, her gaze darting around the pristine apartment. The sleek furniture, the polished floors, the view of the city stretching out beyond the massive windows. It was all too much. She suddenly felt small, out of place, like she didn't belong. Marcus seemed to sense her discomfort. "Come on," he said, gesturing to the couch. "Let's sit. You look like you could use some breakfast." Maya hesitated but eventually followed, sinking into the soft cushions. Marcus disappeared into the kitchen, returning a few minutes later with a plate of eggs and toast. He set it in front of her, along with a glass of orange juice. She stared at the food, her hands trembling. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus sat across from her, his expression calm but earnest. "Because I've been where you are," he said. "Not exactly, but close enough to understand. When I was a kid, my mom and I lived in a car for almost 6 months. She worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat, but it was never enough. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like no one cares. I care, Maya, and I want to help." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. She picked up the fork and began eating slowly, the warmth of the food spreading through her like a balm. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. Over the next few days, Marcus worked tirelessly to create a plan for Maya. He reached out to a trusted lawyer, explaining the situation in vague terms to protect Maya's privacy. The lawyer helped him understand the legal options available, including how to petition for temporary guardianship. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to earn Maya's trust. He didn't push her to share more than she was ready to. But when she did open up, he listened without judgment. Slowly, pieces of her story began to emerge. Maya's grandmother had been her rock, raising her after her mother left when she was just a baby. But when her grandmother passed away 2 years ago, Maya was placed in foster care. The homes had been cold, impersonal places where she felt more like a burden than a child. After bouncing between placements, she had run away, determined to survive on her own rather than endure another loveless household. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Maya said one evening, her voice trembling as she sat on Marcus's couch. "She promised she'd always take care of me." "She did take care of you," Marcus said gently, "and she'd want you to be safe now." Maya nodded, tears streaming down her face. "But what if trusting you is a mistake?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Then that's on me," he said, "but I'll do everything in my power to prove it's not." The next hurdle was school. Marcus insisted that Maya return to class, but she was hesitant, afraid of the whispers and stares from her classmates. To make it easier, Marcus took her shopping for new clothes and supplies, paying for everything without hesitation. "You don't have to do all this," Maya said as they left the store, her arms full of bags. "I want to," Marcus replied. "And you deserve it." The first day back was difficult, but Marcus was there to drop her off and pick her up, a steady presence that gave her courage. Slowly, the whispers faded, replaced by a few tentative smiles from classmates who noticed the change in her. 2 weeks later, Marcus sat across from Maya in the office of a social worker who specialized in helping runaway youth. The woman, a kind but no-nonsense professional, explained the next steps. Marcus had officially applied for temporary guardianship, and while the process would take time, the social worker assured them that Maya wouldn't be forced back into foster care. Maya listened silently, her hands clenched in her lap. When the meeting ended, she looked up at Marcus, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "What if they don't let me stay with you?" she asked. "They will," Marcus said confidently. And if they don't, we'll fight. Together. Maya nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through her doubt. A month later, the court approved Marcus's petition. The judge, moved by Marcus's commitment and Maya's improvement since living with him, granted him temporary guardianship with the option to apply for permanent custody in the future. When they left the courthouse, Maya turned to Marcus, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you do all this for me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Marcus knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Because someone once helped me when I thought no one cared," he said. "And because you're worth it, Maya. You're worth everything." For the first time, Maya smiled. A real, genuine smile. And in that moment, she believed him. Together, they walked out of the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a new beginning. A chance for both of them to heal, to grow, and to prove that even in the darkest of times, hope could light the way. A new chapter. The days that followed the court's decision were a whirlwind for both Maya and Marcus. For the first time in years, Maya felt the faint stirrings of stability, though it was unfamiliar and fragile, like holding a bird in her hands. Marcus, too, found his life transformed. What had started as an impulse to help a stranger had grown into a deeply personal mission, reshaping his understanding of what it meant to care for someone. But while the legal victory was a milestone, it was far from the end of the journey. They both knew that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a process, one that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to confront the pain of the past. Maya sat cross-legged on the floor of Marcus's living room, her new sketchbook open in front of her. Colored pencils were scattered around her as she worked on a drawing of the city skyline she could see from the apartment's towering windows. The lines were precise, the shading meticulous, but her mind wandered as her hand moved across the page. She still struggled to believe that this was her life now, that she wasn't sleeping on a cracked slide or hiding from the whispers at school. The idea of permanence felt too far-fetched, too good to be true. Part of her was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Marcus to change his mind, or for some unseen force to rip this new life away from her. But then Marcus walked into the room, holding 2 mugs of hot cocoa, and the doubt softened. He set one down beside her and sat on the couch, watching her work. "That's incredible," he said, nodding at the drawing. "You've got serious talent." Maya shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It's just a hobby." Marcus shook his head. "It's more than that. Have you ever thought about doing something with it? Like art school?" Maya froze, her pencil hovering over the page. "Art school," she repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why not?" Marcus asked. "You're talented, Maya, and you deserve to chase your dreams." Maya looked down at her drawing, her chest tightening. She had spent so long in survival mode that the idea of having dreams, let alone pursuing them, felt foreign. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "Well," Marcus said, "we'll figure it out. Together." At school, things slowly began to change for Maya. With Marcus's encouragement, she joined the art club, where she found herself surrounded by students who shared her passion for drawing. For the first time, she felt a sense of belonging, though it was tentative, like testing the strength of ice beneath her feet. One afternoon, she was sketching in the corner of the art room when a classmate named Ellie approached her. "Hey," Ellie said, peering over Maya's shoulder. "That's amazing. Did you do that from memory?" Maya nodded, unsure how to respond. Compliments still made her uncomfortable. Ellie grinned. "You've got to show this at the next art show." "Seriously?" "I don't know," Maya began, but Ellie cut her off. "Come on. Everyone would love it, and you deserve the recognition." Maya glanced at her drawing, a detailed portrait of her grandmother. The thought of sharing it with others made her stomach twist, but Ellie's enthusiasm was infectious. Maybe, just maybe, she could do it. Marcus was thrilled when Maya told him about the art show. He helped her pick out a frame for her drawing and even volunteered to attend the event, despite his packed schedule. On the night of the show, Maya stood nervously by her framed piece, watching as students, parents, and teachers wandered through the room. She wore a new outfit Marcus had bought her, and her hair was neatly braided, a stark contrast to the girl who had once hidden in a playground slide. As people stopped to admire her work, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't experienced in years. Marcus stood nearby, his smile as wide, as if he had been the one exhibiting the art. "I told you people would love it," Ellie whispered, nudging Maya with her elbow. Maya smiled, her cheeks flushing. "Thanks," she said softly. When the show ended, Marcus and Maya walked back to the car in comfortable silence. As they drove home, Marcus glanced at her and said, "I hope you know how proud I am of you." Maya looked out the window, her heart swelling. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. But not every day was easy. There were moments when the weight of Maya's past would creep in, threatening to pull her back into the darkness. Sometimes it was a nightmare that left her gasping for air. Other times, it was a fleeting memory that sent her spiraling into doubt. One evening, Marcus found her sitting on the floor of her room, clutching her grandmother's scarf. Her face was streaked with tears, and her shoulders trembled with silent sobs. "Hey," Marcus said gently, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong?" Maya shook her head, unable to speak. Marcus sat with her in silence, his presence steady and reassuring. Finally, she whispered, "I miss her. I miss her so much." Marcus nodded, his own throat tightening. "I know," he said. "And it's okay to miss her. She loved you, Maya. And she'd be so proud of the person you're becoming." Maya leaned into him then, her walls momentarily crumbling. Marcus wrapped an arm around her, holding her as she cried. It was a quiet moment, but it felt monumental, a turning point in their relationship. As the months passed, Maya continued to grow. She excelled in her classes, made new friends, and started to dream again. She even began to think about the future, something she had once avoided, convinced it held nothing for her. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony overlooking the city, Marcus handed Maya an envelope. She opened it cautiously, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "It's an application for a summer art program," Marcus said. "I think you'd be perfect for it." Maya stared at him, her hands shaking. "You really think I can do this?" "I don't just think it," Marcus said. "I know it." For the first time, Maya felt the weight of her doubts begin to lift. She still had a long way to go, but with Marcus by her side, she believed she could face whatever challenges lay ahead. As they sat together, the city lights twinkling around them, Maya realized something profound. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. This was her new chapter, a story of hope, resilience, and the power of human connection. And as the future stretched out before her, Maya knew she wasn't alone. She had Marcus, her dreams, and the unwavering belief that she was worth fighting for. Forging a future. Spring had arrived, painting the city in hues of green and gold. Maya sat at the small desk in her room, the application for the summer art program spread out before her. Her pencils and brushes were neatly arranged in a jar beside her, and her most recent sketch, a vibrant depiction of the park she had once called home, lay nearby, waiting to be included in her submission. It had taken weeks for her to summon the courage to start the application. Even with Marcus's unyielding support, doubt still crept in, whispering that she wasn't good enough, that her past would always hold her back. But with every word she wrote and every piece she selected, Maya felt those doubts grow quieter. "Ready for dinner?" Marcus's voice floated from the hallway. "In a minute," Maya called back, her focus on the form. She carefully attached the final piece of her portfolio to the application, her heart pounding as she slid it all into an envelope. It wasn't just an application. It was a declaration. She was claiming her right to a future. At the dinner table, Marcus noticed the shift in her demeanor. "You seem lighter tonight," he remarked, setting a plate of spaghetti in front of her. Maya smiled, a small, genuine smile that warmed Marcus's heart. "I finished the application." "That's incredible," Marcus said, his pride evident. "What's the next step?" "I just need to mail it," Maya said. "The deadline's next week." Marcus nodded. "We'll send it first thing tomorrow. And no matter what happens, Maya, I'm proud of you." Her smile faltered slightly. "What if they don't accept me?" "Then we'll find another path," Marcus said without hesitation. "This is just one step of many, and no single outcome defines you." Maya nodded, comforted by his words. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of excitement about what lay ahead. But life wasn't done testing her resilience. A few weeks after submitting her application, Maya received an unexpected message. Her biological mother had reached out through social services. The news hit her like a tidal wave, stirring up emotions she had buried long ago. Maya had no memories of her mother, only the stories her grandmother had told her, some good, some painful. Her mother had left when Maya was just a baby, chasing dreams that didn't include a child. Now, after all these years, she wanted to reconnect. Maya sat on the couch, the letter from social services trembling in her hands. "Why now?" she whispered, her voice tinged with anger and confusion. Marcus sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I can't answer that," he said gently. "But I think the real question is, what do you want?" Maya looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know. Part of me wants to meet her, but another part is afraid. What if she just disappears again?" Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But this is your choice, Maya. No one else's." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Can I think about it?" "Of course," Marcus said. "Take all the time you need." In the days that followed, Maya wrestled with her feelings. She poured her emotions into her art, creating piece after piece as she tried to make sense of her tangled thoughts. Her drawings shifted from joyful memories of her grandmother to abstract depictions of loss and longing. Each line and shade felt like a conversation with herself, a way to confront the pain she had avoided for so long. One evening, as she sat in her room surrounded by sketches, Marcus knocked on the door. "Mind if I come in?" Maya gestured for him to enter, her hands still moving across the paper. "I've been thinking," Marcus said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "About your mother." Maya paused, her pencil hovering mid-stroke. "I don't know what her intentions are," Marcus continued. "But I do know this. Meeting her doesn't mean you have to let her back into your life permanently. It can be on your terms, and you can set boundaries." Maya nodded slowly. "But what if she doesn't care? What if it's just nothing?" "Then that's on her," Marcus said. "Not you. You're not responsible for her actions, Maya. You never were." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and reassuring. For the first time, she felt like she could face this decision without being consumed by it. A week later, Maya agreed to meet her mother. The social worker arranged the meeting at a neutral location, a quiet community center on the edge of the city. Marcus accompanied her, offering silent support as they waited in the small, sunlit room. When her mother walked in, Maya's breath caught. The woman looked older than she had imagined, her face lined with years of hard living. But her eyes, brown and filled with a mixture of hope and regret, were unmistakably familiar. "Maya," her mother said softly, taking a hesitant step forward. "You've grown so much." Maya stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Her mother sighed, her shoulders sagging. "Because I made mistakes, big ones, and I've spent years trying to fix my life. I know I can't undo the past, but I wanted to see you, to tell you I'm sorry." Maya stared at her, a storm of emotion swirling in her chest. She wanted to yell, to cry, to demand answers. But instead, she said, "You left. Grandma was there for me when you weren't." "I know," her mother said, her voice breaking. And I'm so grateful she was. I didn't deserve her kindness, and I don't deserve yours. But I'm here because I want to try, if you'll let me. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Maya looked at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging nod. I don't know if I can forgive you, Maya said finally, but I'm willing to try. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. The weeks that followed were filled with cautious steps. Maya and her mother met a few more times, slowly building a fragile relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Maya questioned whether it was worth the effort. But each meeting brought a little more clarity, helping her reconcile the pain of the past with the possibilities of the future. Meanwhile, life continued to blossom for Maya in other ways. One sunny afternoon, a large envelope arrived in the mail. She tore it open with trembling hands, and when she saw the words "Congratulations, you've been accepted," she let out a laugh that turned into a sob. Marcus found her sitting on the floor, clutching the acceptance letter like it was a lifeline. You did it, he said, his voice full of pride. We did it, Maya corrected, smiling through her tears. The summer art program became a turning point for Maya. Surrounded by talented peers and mentors who encouraged her creativity, she flourished. She learned new techniques, gained confidence in her abilities, and began to see herself not as a survivor, but as an artist with a future. When the program ended, Maya returned home with a portfolio full of work and a heart full of dreams. She had a new sense of purpose and a clearer understanding of who she was and who she wanted to be. Years later, Maya stood in a crowded gallery, her artwork displayed on every wall. The exhibition was her first solo show, a culmination of years of hard work and determination. Marcus stood beside her, his pride evident, as he greeted the guests who came to admire her work. Maya's mother was there too, their relationship still a work in progress, but stronger than it had ever been. As Maya looked around the room, she felt a surge of gratitude for the people who had helped her reach this moment. This was her life now, full of hope, full of possibility. And as she stood in the glow of her success, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer defined by her past. She was defined by her strength, her resilience, and the love that had guided her through the darkest of times.